first traveled all the way down south to the Czechoslovakian border, the town of Breslau. From Breslau, we got back up to Berlin. Then from Berlin, it was from one town to the next. It took us 20 days to travel from Gnedia to Freudenstadt, Germany. Freudenstadt was in the Black Forest area, pretty close to south of Stuttgart, pretty close to the French border and Strasbourg. We got there. The local Nazi Party officials provided. There were a lot of refugee families coming on in. Freudenstadt had been a resort town. They had hotels. Freudenstadt sat in a bowl, and you had hills all around, and there were all kinds of resorts and hotels. All of these had been turned into military hospitals. The estimate was that there were somewhere around 100,000 wounded German soldiers in that town. So initially they put us up in a hotel room, and then they found a place on the edge of a town where one of those hotels had been turned into a military hospital, and we lived upstairs in a little adjacent house. Downstairs was the laundry for the hospital, and on the other hand was a pigsty. And there were 5 Estonian families over there. Each one had a tiny little room, and only fuel that we had was I would go out and pick the spruce and pine cones, and we had a little iron stove, and feed the iron stones to get a little bit of warmth in there. And then, of course, daily air raids constantly. So at nighttime, we would head down into the old mines that had been turned into air raid shelters, and quite frequently it was that you never slept fully through the night. As the war progressed, around first part of May, the entire town population from Freudenstadt and us, we moved into the old mine shafts underneath the hills, and we're waiting for the Allied armies to come on in. And then I think it was early in May, maybe May 2nd, May 3rd, somewhere along that line, don't know the exact date, when all of a sudden, it was a nice spring day. My brother and I had taken a little break, and we went outside to get some fresh air, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose, pardon my French. And it was one explosion on top of another explosion. We hit the ditch by the right side of the road, and it's amazing how deep you can dig with your bare hands when you're sufficiently scared. And we stayed there for about 3 hours. Meanwhile, my mother was going frantic, not knowing what was happening. Then there was a little break, and we ran back on into the shelter. Later on, we found out what had happened. The French commander, who later commanded at Dien Bien Phu, Colonel de Gastries, had sent in a lieutenant on the white flag, knowing that Freudenstadt had only military significant area was the rail yard, the rest of it was hospitals, and asked the town to surrender. And the local Nazi Party official made an extra hole in the lieutenant's forehead. And when he did not return, the French opened up with artillery from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 9 o'clock next morning. The entire center of Freudenstadt was totally destroyed because people were in the shelters and because the hospitals were ringing the hills around the town. The human loss was relatively minor. And then came in the French troops. These were the French African colonial troops, and they proceeded. They had white officers and Moroccan and Senegalese troops, and essentially that was sort of a Russian-style liberation that took place for the Germans. We were fortunate in that Colonel de Gastries established his headquarters right next to the hotel in the hotel garage, and one of the ladies, Mrs. Rebane, that lived there above the pigsty and the laundry along with us. She was absolutely fluent in French, so she went and explained to them that, hey, we're not Germans, we're refugees and so forth. So they put an off-limit sign on the house. And then about 2 weeks later, in the one remaining Catholic church over there, they had a celebratory mass over there, and the small contingent of Estonians over there, my sister Aime was delegated to. She was 11 years old, and she gave him a little bunch of flowers. And I wish I had that photograph because of de Gastries' later fame. De Gastries kissed her on both cheeks. But with the French, they were too friendly with the Russians. Next thing you know, they had Russian officers were coming around asking us to return to Estonia, said everything has changed, and the French were pushing us also. Why don't you go back? Why don't you go back? Well, we knew exactly what would happen if we went back. So what had happened to Germany was divided into zones, occupation zones. There was the English zone to the north, the Russian zone to the east, the American zone in the center and south, and then the French zone closer between Switzerland and France. And those zonal borders were being guarded about that same way as state boundaries were. You had to have all kinds of paperwork in order to move from one zone to the next. So my uncle was able to get a local farmer to get a farm wagon, and so early in September of 45, we escaped from the French zone. And how you can do it in Germany is this: the forests have these trails that in case of forest fire, they can get the fire equipment in there and quickly put that fire on out. So using those forest trails, we got into the American zone without being stopped by anywhere along the line. We ended up in Esslingen in a refugee camp, and from there they moved all of the Estonians to Geisingen, which became the major Estonian camp. There were over 4,000 Estonians finally in Geislingen. And then we applied for, when the immigration started, we applied for to come to the United States. And it was almost a year of investigation. We had to give over 1,400 fingerprints at different times in order to get fully qualified. And I remember I remember I got into an argument in school over here. There was a guy that was trying to bully me a little bit and kept calling me a DP. And I told him, I'm glad I came to America when I came, because I was thoroughly checked out, not when your forebears came at the time when all the riffraff from the boats landed in the American shore. After that, they left me alone. And so finally, in '49, we were able to come to the United States. We got to New York, and we had Mr. Randall was over there. Lee Randall was over there to meet us.
Not me.
And brought us over here to Connecticut, and we lived on a chicken farm with Mrs. Dowers, and Lee Randall again found jobs for the people in Willimantic in the treadmill, and found them places to live. God knows how much time, money, and effort was spent. We were not the only ones. He did this for hundreds and hundreds of people, and that's how I ended up over here. Any questions? Yeah.
You came by boat? What boat did you come with?
I came on the USS Patch. And
how long was the trip?
10 days. 10 days. And I thought that the best thing at that time was that, that Swami Wonder Bread type of a bread.
Yes.
I thought that was great. After about 6 months, I couldn't stand it. Yeah. And another thing that I remember very, very, very distinctly is this. In about a month before we left Estonia, we had a border collie. It's a small sheepdog, very smart, very good at herding animals and so forth. And starting roughly around July, when you could hear the thump of artillery on the Narva front, where the fighting was going on in Sinimäed and so forth, he would go underneath at the front of the stables. There was a huge old ash tree, and every night, without fail, he would go there. And stayed there all night long and howled. Okay, anything? Yeah.
Anything else? that part of the family got to America, what happened to the other part of your family?
What happened to the other part of the family is this. We did not really find out until way in the 1950s. I don't know how many of you knew Mr. Kohl. He was over here, part of the Estonian Society. He had been the editor of the newspaper Sakala in Viljandi, and he was a good friend of my father's. And apparently, roughly around the Tallinn fell on the 22nd, and about that, roughly on the 23rd or so, Kohl had dropped by to see my father, who had been very worried, didn't know what had happened to mother and all the rest of the kids, and so he said, we have a old rattletrap newspaper vehicle, and we are leaving for Pärnu tomorrow morning. And my father said, well, we won't take any baggage whatsoever. We'll just stay on the running boards and take us down to Pärnu, and we'll see if we can't get out. Next morning, as they started to head towards our farm, the local defense forces had said, hey, don't go over there. The Russian troops are roughly about 3 kilometers from where we are right now. Well, our farm was about 3 kilometers from that point. And then later on I found out that once Estonia regained independence and my brother was able to visit, he said that since the car didn't come, they had taken the horse wagon and tried to head on by back roads towards Pärnu, but they already saw that Russian troops were ahead of them, so they turned on back and stayed in the woods until the war was over. My father was then hauled in 1945 periodically for interrogation in Viljandi and sent on back. He was forced to kind of give up the farm for the collective, and then in 1946, he was arrested and kept in prison in Viljandi all the way until January of '48. There he contacted tuberculosis, and they literally threw him out to my brothers. And when he was released, I think he died 2 weeks later. And then in 1949, at the time when some over 20,000 Estonians were deported to Siberia, my two older brothers, my aunt, who was 67 years old at the time, were deported to Novosibirsk Oblast, and they did not get back until about 58 or 59. Both of my brothers got tuberculosis over there, and we got the first letter from them in 1956 through the Red Cross, whatnot. And so Dr. Keys over here in Rhode Island wrote up the prescriptions for the latest TB medicines, and we sent TB medicines, which they did get. The TB medicine cost $40, but the tariff to get it into the Soviet Union was $800. But we were able to make 2 shipments, which they did get, which helped to arrest the TB at the time. Along with this, on my mother's side, my uncle on the mother's side, he was arrested in '45 and was moved to the Gulag in the Vorkuta coal mines, and he died there in '47. My uncle Bet on father's side was taken to Karaganda mines, and he died in Siberia. My mother's brother's family was deported in '49 to Irkutsk, and finally ended up on Kamchatka Peninsula along the Pacific Ocean. And actually the only brother that escaped was my father's older brother. Right after the Russian occupation started, they came looking for him, and people made out as if nobody was at home. They shot the dog in the yard and rattled around the farm and left. So that night they escaped and got into Tallinn, and that was in October of 1944. And it was so messed up in Tallinn that they essentially disappeared into the crowd, and they were the only ones who escaped the retribution. My brothers got back. My brothers got back 58, 59. They were initially denied authorization to live in Estonia by the communist government, and they were restricted to 25 kilometer radius from Viljandi, and had to report every week to the KGB, and only work that they could have was construction work. But at least they had some work. Okay? Yeah?
Why did your father and your uncle get arrested?
Because essentially he was an Estonian patriot. He had fought against the Russians in the War of Independence. He had served in the government, and consequently he was considered opposed to the Soviet government, and that was it. Okay.
Yep.
I want to thank Martinson for everything you did today to tell us about his life. And this is just something
Yeah.
to bring home to the family.
Yeah. Thank you.
Estonian bread is always important.
Yeah.
We really
Yeah.
appreciate you coming. This is an important piece of history that we all need to hear. We hear about the history of many other countries and the Holocaust that have happened, but the Estonian country has also had its own kind of Holocaust. People going to Siberia, not returning, right? And that just needs to be heard and known.
During the Second World War, Estonia lost, and there's argument, between 20 to 25% of the total population. If you were to take this from United States, you would have to knock off about 80 to 90 million people.